Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories. Ho, 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 ho. It's me, Sir Humphrey, filling in for your old pal Bigfoot. Welcome to an extra-long Christmas special filled with some of the scariest Dogman and werewolf stories of all time. And let's kick the celebration off with this classic tale that we call
the 2014 snowstorm Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a wintertime Dogman story for you. It's a story I almost didn't survive to share, as it happened inside what might have been the worst snowstorm to ever hit Georgia or the American Southeast. I almost froze to death in that snow, and the only thing that kept me going was the Dogman snapping at my heels. Let me start at the beginning of the story, which was actually in Florida, not Georgia. It was February in 2014, and I had attended a business sales meeting for the company I worked for down in Miami, where it was warm and nice. When it came time to go home, the forecast was for a bad snowstorm to hit Georgia. A number of the attendees got early flights out, and I was urged not to drive home to Virginia through that weather. I had learned to doubt weather forecasters, though, as they seemed to always be predicting storms that never materialized, or at least were never as fierce as they predicted. I thought it sounded like a nice and peaceful drive home, watching the snow fall silently and having the roads largely to myself. Well, by the time I was driving north through Georgia, I sure had the roads to myself all right. There were abandoned cars here and there, but no working ones. It looked like the world had ended. There were no people anywhere, just remnants of what looked like a defeated and crushed former human civilization. The radio was telling me that all flights from local airports were canceled until further notice. Literally thousands of flights called off. I realized I had bet on the wrong horse, that I was in deep poo-poo. Giving up a little too late can sometimes be a problem for me. I get stuck in my ways sometimes, and I adapt too slowly. I guess it took this snowstorm to get me to realize that. It wasn't the first time I had miscalculated in this way, but it was the one that led to the worst inconveniences I'd ever brought down on myself. I finally decided to get off the highway and look for a local hotel at a point where the traction was so low that I literally was driving along at about 5 miles per hour. The car began overheating and conked out so fast that I didn't even have time to pull off to the side of the road once I realized what was happening. I was stalled in the right lane of the highway. I had seen a motel about 2 exits back, but that seemed like a hike that would take me 2 hours in that weather. I hoped that I might find a closer place to stay if I walked forward through the snow to the next town. Again, why did I make this decision in such an uninformed manner? I had maps in my glove compartment of the entire route from Florida to Virginia. And I possibly might have had them on my phone as well, but I don't remember that part. The GPS on my car was broken, but I had at least one other, maybe 2 other options. Yet, I still decided to just play a hunch again and walk further north. This, in spite of the fact that it was a hunch of mine which had led me into this situation in the first place. If I could go back in time and call myself an idiot, I would. But sometimes we have to almost get ourselves destroyed before we can learn a lesson, and that's the way it was with me. I trudged down the highway with the wind blowing snow into my eyes, making them burn and making it harder to see. Everything was white. I started walking for short distances with my eyes clamped shut, then opening them to regain my bearings, then closing them to walk a bit further. After about a half hour of this, I was still on the highway looking for the exit. I thought about walking back to the relative warmth of my car, but when I turned around, I literally couldn't see it any longer. It might take me even longer to walk back than it had taken me to walk to where I was. Returning to my forward movement, I eventually did find the turnoff, which was uphill and very slippery. The wind picked up, and I managed to slip and fall, completely losing my sense of direction in the process. When I had caught my breath to get up and walk again, I soon discovered I had taken a wrong turn somewhere, and I was now walking through trees. I wasn't sure how I had even ended up there, as the ramp leading off the highway had seemed to be lined by snowy ground on both sides. I stopped and turned around and around and around, looking to find anything that seemed at all familiar, anything that might tell me where I had turned wrong, or where I should turn now to get it right. The more I looked, however, the more confused I became, and so I decided to give up and ask for help. I reached into my pocket and felt around for my cell phone, but it was not there. I panicked and checked every pocket, but I had a distinct memory of placing it in my right front jacket pocket, and it was not there. I thought it must have fallen out when I took that tumble back there near the off-ramp from the highway, so I turned in what I guessed would be the direction to get back there, and I began trudging along semi-blindly. I knew I was in a really bad situation, and I was beginning to grasp that every single decision I had made was only making things worse and worse. This was moving from me being delayed and inconvenienced to me entering a life-threatening situation out of which I might never climb. My heart was now beating in a somewhat panicked way, and I was beginning to grow very scared. I noticed my toes were cold and wet, and that they were in the first stages of starting to grow numb. I was beginning to fill with sadness and regret on top of the panic, and I needed something good to happen fast. That's when I saw something incredibly massive moving through the snowstorm. When I say massive, in this case, I mean man-mountain kind of massive. It was something maybe 8 feet tall, too large to be a man. It was partially in silhouette, and it was covered in snow. It was moving along in my general direction through the trees which surrounded both of us. My first impression was that it was literally an abominable snowman, in the sense of an animated man made of snow walking toward me. Then, when it got maybe 40 or 50 feet away, it stopped and shook itself, not unlike the way a dog will shake rain or snow off of itself. When it did so, I could make out a very wolf-like head on top of this man-like creature. So, it was not a Yeti, and it was not a Sasquatch, but it was as tall and wide as either are reported to be. I cursed out loud. I think I was cursing the fates or something. The dog-headed man-mountain didn't seem to care for my attitude, though, and it dropped to all fours, lowering its head to my level and baring its incredibly long teeth at me. If it wanted to impress, it succeeded. I was ready to end this farce at that point. I was ready to drop to my knees like a bad football player and get ready to meet my maker, and it's possible I even might have done that literally. Parts of it get all blacked out in my memory now, as I was probably in shock, and my brain might have been getting ready to go out of business and shut down for good. The next thing I remember clearly was marching through the woods, hearing the giant beast behind me. I could hear it matching me step for step, and when I would slow down, it would growl from behind me and way up over my head. At that point, I would speed up as much as I could, but exhaustion and frostbite were going to catch up sooner or later, and there wasn't going to be anything I would be able to do to keep moving forward at that point. I was becoming loopy and emotional, feeling dizzy and sentimental. I wished I could talk to the Dogman and find out what he really was. Was he a kind of a bear? Or an ancient ground sloth? How could a dog walk upright or grow to such an enormous size? I wanted it to know I bore it no ill will, even if it decided to eat me later on to stay alive. Better for one of us to survive than neither of us, I thought. I was becoming a blithering idiot, but When everything seems about to end, you can get sentimental for what once was. So many things we take for granted in life, then, when they all get taken away, we suddenly feel such a deep sense of love for them. It's like how some people jump out of airplanes so that they can remember to appreciate how fragile life is. They put themselves in situations where they need to be completely alert in order to get through it, uninjured and alive. That's exactly where I was, and from that vantage point, even the harder times of my life seemed so comfortable in comparison. I remembered back to being forced by my parents to shovel snow. I was so bummed out by it, so resentful. I felt like they were trying to freeze me to death, and that they didn't care about me just because my toes would be cold by the time I got back inside. At least I could feel my toes back then. Oh, how I wished I could shovel my parents' driveway one more time. Oh, to go back to having the problems I used to have. The worst things that had ever happened to me in my entire life seemed like a Hawaiian vacation compared to what I was trying to survive on that day. The huge Dogman growled, and I realized I had been standing still, nearly falling asleep on my feet. This wasn't going well, and it was only getting worse and worse and worse. I had run out of ideas, and I had run out of strength. I was beginning to lose my logical mind. Soon, I knew I would lose consciousness as well, and then that would be all she wrote. At least I might pass while asleep, I thought. It might be a peaceful way to go. Maybe I was lucky, I thought. Just like I didn't appreciate shoveling snow when I was young, maybe I wasn't appreciating the mercy and kindness being shown to me on that day. Maybe this was my fate, and maybe it was a sign of universal love that I would only comprehend once I was permanently out of my limited human ego. Or maybe that Dogman would have me for lunch, and maybe it would be the most excruciatingly horrible experience that a living thing could suffer through. My face was frozen, and my mind was feeling like it was beginning to get ready to congeal as well. My brain was probably turning to jello, I thought. That made me laugh, or at least it made me want to laugh. My face felt frozen, and the strength for laughter had long since gone. I turned around, ready to offer myself to the Dogman beast. I tried to talk, but words didn't come out. I blinked through the raging snow and tried to meet the eyes of the beast for one last time. While I was doing so, I caught sight of a third member of the party. There was a large black bird in a tree, and it was working hard to keep itself on that branch of that tree. The wind and snow were conspiring to knock it off, but the bird was resisting them. Why was it there? It should have left before the weather got this bad. That bird was as denatured as I was. It was just like me, which meant it was stupid. I felt my heart going out to the creature. It was my soulmate. It was the same as I was. We had lived our entire lives only to end up getting to pass on side by side. This was my brother. This was my best friend. And it didn't matter that we were only going to spend this brief moment together. Our lives were still inextricably entwined, and we were one and the same conscious entity. This is how I felt. Then, an idea popped into my frozen daiquiri of a brain. Give the Dogman the bird to eat instead of me. All the feeling of camaraderie and kinship disappeared in one moment, as I spied a sharp-looking rock on the ground and bent over to pick it up. Confusion ensued. Then I realized I had fallen over into the snow. I wanted to go to sleep, but I knew the sleep would never end if I did. So, I relocated the rock, grasped it, and slowly began the process of regaining my footing. Once I was again as bipedal as the huge Dogman, I aimed, as well as I could, toward that large ebony flying animal. And I fired. That projectile as hard and as unerringly as I could toward my target. I knew that it was him or me, that if I couldn't offer the Dogman a worthy sacrifice, he would take me instead. Everything that I had ever done in my life had led up to this single moment, and I had to put all of myself into that throw. Nothing ever had mattered so much, and if I were to continue to survive, I would need to get this throw right. The stone slipped out of my frozen hand and landed a pathetic few feet in front of me. I collapsed to the ground, and I wept, or as close as I could get to weeping under the circumstances. I had failed. I had fallen in an odd way, and I was watching the Dogman now. I was kind of upside down and sideways on top of something, I didn't know what. Maybe I had broken my body on a large stone because I knew I was unable to move. All that was left of me were my eyes and my delusional, illogical remnants of consciousness. As I watched, I saw that Dogman had noticed the bird I'd been trying to give it as an offering. It reached out and grabbed it, then swallowed it in no short order. At least, that's the way my memory tells me it happened. Seems impossible that it could have gone down that way, but the images in my mind tell me the story in just that way. Then, I watched as the Dogman walked back the way that he and I had come from, and I prayed that he would go find my cell phone and bring it back to me. That's how illogical and far gone I was at that moment. It felt so good to lay there. I decided that it wouldn't hurt anything if I just took a little nap. Maybe I would even recover some of my strength if I did that. It made more and more sense to just go to sleep, and I couldn't remember anymore why I had been trying to stay awake. So silly, to be awake and hurting all over when one could be dreaming and feeling fine. That part of me that wanted to stay awake was mocked and driven away, and soon I found myself in dreamland. My entire body ached as I woke up in a very ugly room I was entirely unfamiliar with. I tried to sit up, but that hurt even worse, so I stopped trying. Then I tried to speak, but I coughed instead and coughed again, feeling as though I were going to choke. There was a flurry of activity, and human beings were there, moving me and doing things to me that I couldn't really understand. They were terrifying me. They had their hands all over me like I was some sort of object, and I wanted to scream in horror, but I was too busy choking. There were other incidents like that one, spaced out by long dreamless sleeping periods. I was in a hospital. It took days before I was back to normal enough for the nurses and doctors to start explaining things to me. Apparently, search teams were sent out looking for people who had abandoned their vehicles on the highway. They were able to identify me from my license plates, and so they knew who they were searching for, and that I had not yet checked into any hotel or motel or hospital. I hadn't thought of that, but it made perfect sense once they explained how I was found. I had such an intense feeling of gratitude for the people who think ahead and set up agencies that can function in such a wise way to save the least wise of us, such as myself. I felt, and still feel, extremely humbled by my debt to those people. I literally would have been a goner that day, and instead, I'm fully recovered and only missed 1 week of work. They got to me before the frostbite did, and in spite of all my terrible decisions on that day, I got away with all of it. After they told me their stories of how I was saved, I started telling anyone who would listen about the Dogman who had followed behind me and kept me going through those woods on that snowy day. They would give each other weird looks and regard me as though I were insane. Only one of the nurses acted like she believed me, but she saw the story as my brain going into shutdown and hallucinating. She said that quite often people who think they are about to perish will see angels and guardians who help guide them to safety. She told me that it's just a part of ourselves that we project outward to help us feel safe in an unsafe situation. Of course, that was absurd. This was no angel. This was something closer to a devil. This was not a comforting presence. It was a giant monster that wanted to eat me. This was not something I was glad to see coming. This was something I was glad to see going. That Dogman was as real as the bird I tried to sacrifice to it. Yes, it kept me going that day, but it was just because it didn't want to waste energy fighting me. It wanted to wait until I couldn't fight back, then take me without resistance. It was no holy vision. It was a giant land carnivore, and I didn't hallucinate it. I escaped it. Nobody in my family, and none of my friends, think that I saw a real Dogman. They all agree with the doctors and nurses, even though the doctors and nurses weren't making sense. I will never change my story, because it is the truth. I saw, and I survived, the 2014 snowstorm Dogman. The Hanukkah Dogman Miracle. Dear Scary Stories NYC, this is a story that happened when my husband Morton and I were both 51 years old in the year 2003. We were out driving in the cold in December, heading home from my husband's Uncle Lenny's house, where we had celebrated the last night of Hanukkah that year. It was a lovely time, and I was looking forward to getting home to my warm bed. Well, such a thing was not to happen on that night. We were on some godforsaken highway in some godforsaken woods when Morton had a flat tire. He momentarily lost control of the vehicle, and the car spun out of control into a tree. The tree missed smashing me by 2 feet, possibly, but it bent the front right wheel around itself before we came to a halt. Then flames erupted from the engine, and we got out of the car expecting it to blow up like they do on television. Neither of us were feeling injured yet, but a doctor explained it to me later on that this was because we were in shock without realizing that we were in shock. I know I felt perfectly normal, but I was actually flying high on adrenaline or whatever it is that nervous systems flood you with at times like this. The doctor told me that it was this state of shock that produced a wolfman or dogman who appeared to walk out of the woods and come across the highway toward me and my Morton. The doctor told me later that the werewolf was never real, but that Morton and I were having a mass hallucination. He said we were both hallucinating the same thing. I don't see how that's possible, because to me the wolfman was real in every way that I could tell. Isn't the scientific method about using your senses to judge what is real? Well, I heard this werewolf. It sounded halfway between a crazed mongrel dog and a baboon or gorilla. It smelled like the zoo. It looked angry and very agitated. It was breathing way too hard. It didn't need to be panting like that. So it was clearly upset. Stop me when I say something that sounds like a hallucination to you. Still, I am not a doctor, so maybe Morton and I got chased into the cold woods on that dark night by a hallucination from our imaginations. When we found a small house, we ran up to it, hoping that whoever lived there would let us in. But it wasn't really a home. It was more of a shack in the middle of the woods. Just a shack made out of parts of older buildings, with a couple of windows in 2 sides of it. The door was open, so we went inside and hunkered down in the darkness. The werewolf man was on us pretty soon after we got inside, and he tried to push the door open. Morton held it shut by keeping his legs propped up on the door. I looked around, and it didn't seem that this place was going to hold up for long if that monster decided to get serious about huffing and puffing and blowing our house down. Soon enough, the monster had walked around to the side of the little building and was looking right at me through the window. I could barely see anything. It was such a dark night. Meanwhile, you know that Dogman had eyes that could see in the dark much better than me or my Morton. Even though it was 2 against 1, it seemed like an unfair fight to me, and I was scared about our chances of surviving the night. I dropped to my knees desperately and began searching around inside that shack. This must have been a place for storage. Storage of what? Apparently storage of useless garbage. But then, I found a generator, at the same time as the dog-headed bear man smashed one of the windows in. I pulled this thingy on the whatnot, and va-ba-ba-ba-room, the world's loudest engine roared into life. As it sputtered on, so did this incredibly bright searchlight that I had not noticed was also in the shack there with us. The werewolf did not like that loud generator, and it liked the bright light even less. It backed away into the woods. I could still see it off in the distance behind a tree, but it wasn't close enough to do any harm anymore. I told Morton all we have to do now is wait till the morning, and we could go find a payphone and call a tow truck. Morton is always so gloomy though, God love him, and he checked the fuel level in the generator. The generator's almost out of gas, he reported solemnly. It's 8 hours till sunlight, but we only have maybe 1 hour of fuel left for this light. I gasped. Morton, what night is it tonight? It's the final day of Hanukkah. This is the holiday celebrating fuel for lights lasting whatever it was 8 times more than the usual, just like our generator is going to have to do. It was a mitzvah. We were being asked to have faith. Morton told me I was a crazy cat lady, and there is some truth to that, but it didn't mean I wasn't right. We were being asked to have faith, and I know I did. I told Morton to hold me for warmth, and the two of us napped lightly until the sound of the engine sputtering out woke us both up. But the sunlight of the dawn was already streaking into that little 2-window shack. I looked outside and I couldn't see any hairy monsters anywhere. I have read that dog-headed entities guard the places where life and death cross over. For this reason, I implore you, if you go into the dark places where such creatures exist, bring your own faith. Whatever faith that is, bring it with you, and cling to it until you are back in the normal daylit world again. That's the lesson I learned from the Hanukkah Dogman miracle. Mix black and white and you get gray. Mix executive with producer and you get Angie K. Please join me in thanking tonight's executive producer Angie K for helping to make this episode possible. Angie likes our Dogman stories, but not so much the other ones though. If you would like to get to see the secret members only episodes that Angie gets to see, then you can join our channel. Welcome to Scary Stories. I'm a full-time werewolf. The werewolf can't change back. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I caught lycanthropy from what I thought was an ordinary wolf, and now I'm permanently locked in as a werewolf, unable to return to human form. I've only become a sort of full-on werewolf once or twice, and that was back toward the early days. I'm mainly humanoid-looking, and I can even pass for human in a crowd if I wear a hat and a bulky coat. I can control my temper about as well as any other steroid freak, and so far that's been good enough to keep me out of any major trouble. I also spend my winters sharing my wealth by secretly leaving presents in the night for disadvantaged kids of working-class families. I can't help but be sneaky about stashing the presents away in these kids' homes. Part of that is I don't want any credit for leaving the presents. Part of it was something my accountant said to me, and the other part is my naturally sneaky wolf nature. Because I can no longer help it. I am part wolf, all the time. But there are some major differences from me before and me now, which I'll get into some detail about. It's hard to even remember that I wasn't always this way, but I was a fairly normal guy once upon a time. One of the companies I own is a shipping company, and I was doing the undercover boss thing there. I took a manual labor job so I could better understand why 2 employees had recently quit work at that location. Anyway, believe it or not, this freaking wolf was being shipped through our office. It was in this old wooden box that didn't seem like it could possibly be legal to ship a creature like that inside of. While I was feeling sorry for it and getting friendly with it, this animal decided to try to bite 2 of my fingers off. It held them tight in its mouth, and I never felt such pain in my life. I don't know why, but the wolf opened its mouth for a second, and I withdrew my hand as fast as you would have done it. I had 2 broken and bloody fingers, and I was screaming in a panic. I really was thinking that they were going to have to be amputated. It was a horrible mess. Someone drove me to the hospital and they stitched me up and they told me both fingers would heal. I was surprised by this, but quite relieved, obviously. It had seemed so much worse in the beginning. Well, by the next morning, not only were the bones in my fingers healed, but the skin was better and the stitches had just sort of popped out and landed on my bedsheets. It was like the body had rejected them or something. Over the course of the morning into the early afternoon, I found myself in excruciating pain as parts of my body seemed to be ripping themselves apart and reforming themselves on a molecular level. My eyes changed on that morning, with my vision becoming far more powerful than it had ever been before, especially at night. They're blue now, too. A very bright and light blue like you'd see in a husky or whatever. I gained over 100 pounds that morning as well, and it was nearly all muscle, too. I'm a few inches taller than I used to be, and I'm as strong as 3 men now. I'm fast, too, but I don't want to clock myself. I sometimes get hairier arms and legs than other times, but I more or less stay in this shape and form 24/7 these days. I have not yet transformed back to human, and I'm starting to give up hope that it'll ever happen. But I am not in pain, and I am stronger than I ever was before, so I have to say there is an upside to the situation. There are only a handful of people who even know about this. There are a few dozen more who understand parts of it. I keep myself out of the public eye, and I hide in my compound lifting weights and running my various operations remotely from there. When I go out, it's at night, usually wearing a hoodie or a hat. I said before I can pass in a crowd, but that doesn't mean I feel I should push it. I'm fine if I keep my head down and keep walking, but I wouldn't want someone to look at me too closely though. I won't lie. Part of the reason I deliver Christmas gifts anonymously is that an accountant figured out some way that it was more cost-effective to do it this way, for some reason that only a tax accountant would understand. Plus, it's just plain fun. I get to be like Santa Claus and like Batman at the same time. But even with the super stealth powers of a half-werewolf, I do sometimes get caught in the act. It's just that it's the act of giving at Christmas time, and so far I've been able to talk my way out of trouble. Like, one time I got caught by a father who was convinced I was planting bombs in his house. He said that if his family tried to open those presents, they'd all be blown sky high. So I asked him to pick out any present for me, and he chose one. Then I opened it up, revealing that it was a big package of kielbasi. That's a kind of sausage from Eastern Europe, basically. This one came wrapped in plastic, and I took a big bite out of it, drawing gasps from the family. Then I chewed it down, plastic packaging and all, and let out a big belch. The family laughed nervously, and I offered to take the presents back if they didn't want them. They wanted them, but they still nervously asked me to open another one for them first, just to make sure. I enjoy those kinds of moments because the one major drawback to this situation is how lonely it can get. There's obviously no other member of my half-species, no female of my kind. I don't think it would be fair of me to date a normal woman. I think that even when I tried to be gentle, I would accidentally be too rough. So my life is working out and managing my businesses from a distance. When the weather gets cooler though, I get to work amassing survey data to understand what gifts might best serve the needs and wants of these kids. Some families need a new laptop or tablet most, while another kid might need a guitar or keyboard to begin learning music. In other words, we spy on the families. That's another one of the businesses I own. We monitor the public so that we know what ads should be sent to them next. I'm using this tech at Christmas time not to sell things to those people, but to find out what we can give them. Again, I don't care if this is the right or ethical way to do things. I'm a wolf. I do what I think must be done, period. In the modern day, Santa really does know when you've been bad or good. So, be good. For goodness sake. Hey, someone asked me if there are any female werewolves in our new werewolf digital coloring book, and I have to say no. I had heard women like the digital coloring book, so I guess I mostly focused on putting macho-looking male werewolves in there. It's 70-something pages for $2.09 and it's a digital download, so you don't have to worry so much about it being mailed to you in time if you get it for a Christmas gift. My friend Checkerphil said it was nightmare fuel, and I take that as a high compliment in this case. Info on how to get it is in the description. And now, here's a letter from a guy who claims to be a rich bastard. I've known some guys like this in real life, and they like to dangle things in front of you to see if you snatch at them. If this next story isn't real, I think it was at least written by someone who's had to deal with rich people in person. It's a Christmas ghost story though, so I'm gonna say thanks for the submission, and I'm gonna read it to you guys to see what you think. And this contributor calls his tale My Father's Christmas Ghost Story. Dear Scary Stories NYC, my father was a very successful man, at least in the eyes of his generation. I didn't really see too much of him growing up, but each Christmas he would force me to sit and pay attention to this same exact story that he had told me the year before. It was a ghost story, and I found that part entertaining, but it was also a moral lecture, and I hated that part. Father knew I hated it, and by the time I was a teenager, he revealed to me that my loathing of the story was the main reason he kept repeating it. You see, my father told me when he thought I was mature enough to understand, this was a story about a turning point in his life. He felt that after this ghost experience, that he had become a different man than he had been before, and he wanted me to grow up understanding this important lesson through repetition. You see, he saw ghosts, and seeing those ghosts was horrifying to Father. He remembered it as a traumatizing experience. In his mind, telling me this story which happened to him years earlier might save me, his son, some trauma, and sort of slip some wisdom into my head and heart too, if he was lucky. So now I'd like to tell you the story from my memory, in my father's own words as well as I can remember them. And if my father is somehow listening to this, then Father, please forgive me if I get facts mixed up. I will try not to. The year was 1947. It was a good year for America. A good year for business. A good year for baseball. 1947 was a good year. It was a prosperous time, so I gave my employees a raise across the board. Some of them pointed out that the raise was not the same as the rate of inflation or some such poppycock, and I fired them immediately. People said that was harsh since Christmas was coming up, and so I fired those complainers too. It was easy to replace them all from within, and when men saw the opportunities for advancement in the company, morale improved. Sure, some families went penniless for Christmas, but their fathers should have watched their mouths. That's how I felt. But you know what, son? I was wrong to feel that way. I had been harsh, and I had been a force for Satan to use for evil purposes. But I didn't come to this realization randomly. I was forced to understand this through a series of circumstances thrust upon me that were just as harsh as what I had been doing to my fellow man. Son, that night I awoke from a nightmare in which all of my ancestors took turns spitting on me and throwing disgusting things on me as I was locked in a stockade in a public square. Somehow I knew that these were my forefathers and that they were sickened by me and ashamed of me. It was the most realistic dream of my life. But when I woke up, I found the waking world to be far, far more horrific. I awoke screaming and parched. So then I got out of my bed and I walked in the darkness toward the bathroom to get some water. Well, there were dead people lined up in some sort of weird military fashion in the hallway. I stepped back into my room and I walked backward into another cold, dead body. I turned on the light, and they were everywhere. They looked familiar. It was as though I had seen them before. I thought I must still be sleeping. The dead all raised their arms to point at me. They all started speaking at once, talking over each other in hoarse, raspy voices. They each blamed me for their deaths. I've never killed anyone, I told them. But they each told me that I had indeed been their murderer. These were people who had lost their money, who had gone broke, who had starved or died in some other way related to their poverty. I didn't see how it would be fair to blame me. I was not the only employer in the world. If I fire a man, nothing is to prevent him gaining employment elsewhere. It isn't a death sentence. But then these dead men, their stories, they all started growing more complex, more detailed. When families are denied a chance to succeed, opportunities are lost for all of humanity. None of these men had been asking for charity, and yet I had found a way to be cruelly uncharitable in each of their cases anyway. Son, I want you to understand that my business will someday be your business. And on the day when that happens, you will become responsible for the lives of not only the men you employ, but also their wives and their children. When God chooses us to manage great wealth, He wants us to be kind and to share His bounty with others. The Western world is spreading the wealth to the poor and middle class more than any other society in history. I ask you and your generation to continue that trend, and to make even the poorest person of your future time richer than the richest man of my past. And so that was how Father would end the story, with a plea to me to be kind to the poors. Of course, as you probably know, my generation oversaw the greatest vacuuming up of wealth in world history, so that the poor today have far less than even the poor of the Great Depression. And that generation was allowed to sing "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime," while we don't allow you to sing protest songs against the rich anymore at all. We ran headlines saying Oliver Anthony was punching down when he was a factory worker singing about politicians in Washington. You would need to make $70,000 a year to make what a poor man made at an average job during the Great Depression. So I would say that my father's ghost story had very little impact on me. When I took over the company, I let everyone know that things were going to be different. For instance, my father used to have a framed quote from Mark Twain on the wall of the main office. It read, "Always do what is right. It'll gratify half of mankind and astound the other." Mark Twain. Now I took that down, and I replaced it with a framed poster of Cartman from South Park saying, "I do what I want." My father once told me that one of his life's goals was to bring luxury and comfort into the lives of even the poorest American. But I say, what's the fun in having cool stuff if poor people can afford to have it too? Like, how can I enjoy air conditioning unless I can see you sweating? That's why my favorite part of my job is firing people. I waited until December 1st to fire 24 employees this year, just to make sure I was putting a damper on their holiday. My attitude is, the less money I pay my workers, the more money for me. And the less time they spend being happy, why then there's just that much more happiness available for me to enjoy instead. And I am the one who should have their happiness, just as only people like me should enjoy any freedom. I will at least know what to do with it. What do poor people know about happiness or freedom? They'd probably waste it on puppies and small children, the idiots. And if the ghost of Christmas past wants to haunt me, I say let him. I don't even believe in any of that religion stuff anyway. I only believe in cold, hard cash. Ghosts aren't real, and what my father saw was his guilty conscience. It was the fatal flaw of his entire generation. They saw poor people as having value. My generation is correcting his generation's mistakes as quickly as we can. You know, the Magna Carta, that's what started the trouble, granting rights to humans who aren't even nobility. Don't worry, we'll do away with the pretenses soon enough. You will have nothing. You will eat insects while we eat beef. And you, my dear friend, you will be, oh, so happy. Merry Christmas. Don't burn your candle at both ends. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I once had a supernatural experience. It was a visitation from beyond the grave, as corny as that might sound. It was a legit vision of some sort, but it looked completely real to me. The thing is, I was a kid who was very hard to impress. I thought of myself as a materialist, and in those days I thought materialism was the same as realism. I don't feel that way anymore. But my behavior throughout this story is that of someone who felt they already understood the entire world at the age of 13. I continued to think I knew better than everyone else for a long time after that too, so don't think of me as any sort of role model. I am an example of what not to do. First of all, if you are so lucky as to get visited by the dead, do not shrug it off. Do not assume it will ever happen again, because there's no guarantee that you will ever get a second chance. It might be scary, and it's probably gonna come at a bad time, like when you're busy or when you're trying to sleep. But try to have a little respect, and pay attention to what you're being told. I once read that Paul McCartney had a vision of his late mother Mary appearing as the Virgin Mother, and she told him, "Let it be." He wrote down her message and came away with a pretty decent song, I'd say. Me? I got a visit from the land of the dead, and I thought I was too important to take notice. I was a fool. Don't be like me. So I had been sleepwalking for a month or two before this incident, and I don't know if my grandfather was also the reason for that. Maybe he had been trying to reach me for a while. I would wake up in places outside not remembering how I'd gotten there. The time I saw Grandpa, it started off like that. I woke up standing outside on a somewhat windy and chilly night. I was standing near a patch of woods behind a swing set on the grounds of the local elementary school that I had once attended. It was at this point that a dead man walked in a kind of a clunky way out of the woods over there. He was so pale he was almost blinding. My family are all pale, but this guy took it to a new level. I recognized him instantly from photos on the piano in my family home. He was the father of my mother. I remembered his features, and I had no doubt it was him. I also remembered hearing that he died when I was very young. I have no memories about him, but I've been told he cared about me a great deal when I was a baby, and he doted over me. You might have thought I would have been nice about this, but I began talking to myself as though my grandfather weren't even there. I told myself I must be hallucinating, or that I really was still asleep. My class in school had recently read the Charles Dickens Christmas Carol out loud. We'd take turns reading and then pass it on as everyone followed along at their desks. I thought the entire thing was a load of hokum. There was no such thing as ghosts, and the idea of them returning from beyond to teach us moral lessons, that was the most laughable idea of all. So when I saw this form moving closer to me, looking like my dead grandfather, I just knew this was a dream or hallucination. My subconscious must have been inspired by the Christmas Carol reading, and now I was being given the Scrooge treatment by my own subconscious. Okay, Grandpa, if that is your real name, what is my Christmas Carol lesson? I demanded to know in the rudest way possible. I watched as this feeble form approached me. He looked frozen all over, walking through the snow out of the woods. He appeared bloody all over too, mostly under the ice. I didn't know at the time when this happened, but my grandfather had died in a car accident. His body's never been found, but the car was found at the bottom of a steep hill and completely smashed to pieces. If I had known that at the time, then it might have made sense for my subconscious to have made Grandpa look so smashed up. But since I assumed at the time that he had died of old age, I should have seen a very different vision of that old man. He was holding something that was lit up and giving off smoke. When he got close enough, I saw that it was literally a candle, burning on both ends. Like that cliche, don't burn your candle from both ends. Don't spend all your fuel before you have a replacement supply. Don't kill yourself in the short term if it might also kill your energy for your long-term goals too. Kind of a weird message to give to a 13-year-old girl, but Grandpa did say he was worried about me becoming too serious when I grew up. Working too hard when I grew up. He kept saying he was warning me about adulthood. Well, I was the most adult 13-year-old that there was, and quite frankly, I could not wait to grow up. I was looking forward to responsibility. I was looking forward to long work days. Heck, I was even looking forward to paying bills. I was a very weird 13-year-old. And I guess that was why Grandpa felt so bad for me that he did all he had to do to get this message to me. Now, he didn't look like a ghost. He looked like a dead man walking painfully in a reanimated corpse. I wonder if he was in great pain, or if it was a kind of a numbness that he felt, being so dead and so frozen. I know one thing I didn't feel in that moment, and that was empathy. I didn't ask Grandpa if I could do anything to ease his discomfort. I didn't offer him anything. I just smirked. I stood there talking to myself about how he wasn't there. And I smirked. The metaphor, the candle burning on both ends in his hand. To me, that was corny. It was like something from a Greek myth. How out of date is that? Old stuff was beneath me because I was so much smarter than those old dead peeps, right? I mean, I was probably the smartest of them all. Looking so sad that his expression still haunts me to this day, Grandfather lowered his shoulders, accepted defeat, and then he shuffled painfully back to hell, or heaven, or wherever he can afford an apartment in the afterlife, I suppose. I grew up fast, and I grew up hard. I was told by a TV commercial that I could have it all, and TV wouldn't lie now, would it? I believed in TV more than I believed in my own ancestor come back from the grave trying to save my soul. I believe people who are paid to lie more than I believe my own flesh and blood looking out for me. So I burned through 3 husbands and 4 children, barely learning my kids' names. One time I called the nanny by my daughter's name and I called my daughter by the nanny's name. I had priorities. I was an important businesswoman with an active love life. Well, this Christmas, none of my husbands wants to see me. None of my children wants to see me. My youngest daughter took her own life rather than have me as a mother for one more day. I've kind of made a mess of everything. None of the hard work I did ended up mattering. Sure, I have money in the bank, but I'd trade it all for one more day with my daughter. Heck, even for one more day with any of my living family. To them, I'm the dead one. If I even tried to apologize, I'd be laughed at. The same way I laughed at my poor grandfather so many years ago. So if you're anything like me, you're rolling your eyes at my corny old-fashioned morality tale, and you're about to fast forward to the Dogman story. I don't blame you. That's what I would have done too. Look, I'm not saying put your phone down, God forbid. I'm not saying go back to living like a human being, heaven forfend. All I'm suggesting here is that it might be a good thing once in a while to maybe make a little eye contact, to maybe listen a bit to what the other girl has to say, or even listen to what men have to say, as crazy an idea as that would be. Alright, maybe don't go that far, but force yourself to slow down once in a while. Force yourself to remember other people are exactly like you, a person who means well, and has dreams and passions same as you do. Even if that other person is your dead grandfather, who passed away when you were a young child. Happy Christmas, everyone. Hey, do any of you like these adult coloring books or digital coloring books? I've heard that some people like them, so I made this one. You can print them out and color them by marker or crayon, or you can color them digitally in whatever manner it is that people do things like that. No, I did not draw these images. I'm the editor and the archivist. The price is $2.09 for over 60 images of scary dogmen and werewolves. We got werewolves chasing ladies. This guy here is running from a werewolf that already bit off half of one of his arms, it looks like. It's a crazy and fun, wild time. I guess you can judge for yourself if it's good for kids. I don't know. I don't have kids myself, so I can't really tell you. I know I would have liked it when I was young, but I don't know if that counts because I was a weird kid. Anyway, the link is in the description and the pinned comment, so check it out if you'd like to. Since it's digital, you can actually get it on Christmas Day as a last-minute present.
Grandma meets a werewolf. is told to Peter Bernard, read by PQ River. My grandmother was in vaudeville back when she was a kid and a teenager. She performed with her parents as a family act. They never rose high in the billing, and by the time she had grown up, the act wasn't getting booked at all anymore. She married an insurance salesman over harsh protests from her parents, and she settled down to raise my mom and then to be the grandma that I knew. Every once in a while, she would pull out an old show business story. The time either Wheeler or Woolsey made a pass at her, the time Chico Marx asked her for a loan and Harpo wanted her not to do it. But my favorite of her vaudeville stories didn't have much to do with show business at all. That's because my favorite story Grandma used to tell was the story of the time in 1916 when she claimed she saw an actual werewolf. When Grandma first started performing, she was only 5 years old. She would do comedy and play percussion when her parents sang. As she got older, the act became more and more about her. The family were often asked to come to dinner and stay over with well-to-do individuals who had seen them perform. It was always much better than the seedy hotels they stayed in when they could afford to stay inside at all, so they always accepted. Because Grandma was a cute kid, people naturally wanted to take care of her, and her parents capitalized on that. As Grandma grew into her teen years, however, they found out that not only did the act not work as well, but they got invited to dinner by the audience members far less often. When they did get asked to socialize, by that point, it was mostly creepy guys looking to get her alone. One night, soon after Grandma's 16th birthday, this guy seemed like a gentleman, invited her dad and mom to dinner at his place, and said the family could stay over. All went well through dinner, but sure enough, he snuck into her bedroom that night and tried to get handsy. Grandma says she screamed for her parents, and the guy got really mad. He threw them and their luggage out of the house, with the three of them still in their sleeping clothes. They got dressed as well as they could right there in front of the man's house, then began the long walk back to the train station. Her father wanted to sleep in the station and get the first train to the next town they were booked to perform in. Her mother wanted them to get a room in the hotel near the station. Their quarreling got increasingly heated, but the night got colder and colder. They had been walking on a dirt road near the edge of a forest. Now Grandma noticed that the forest was still there, but she still wasn't sure in the darkness where the road had gone. Her parents were too busy saying hurtful things to each other to have noticed that they might not be heading in the right direction any longer. She told me this story 3 different times, and the facts were slightly different each version. I would guess I was there for the retelling of this story in 1971, 1972, and either 73 or 74. She died in 1975, at the age of 75, which was old back then. Her memory at the end might have been a little off, and my own memory may be playing tricks on me when I remember this, but in every version of the story, the next thing that happens is she looks towards the woods, and right there, in the first row of trees, she sees an incredibly large, hairy man with the head of a feral dog. She gasped and hid behind her father, who immediately got out the pistol he carried for self-defense. He began shouting toward the forest, and my grandmother realized that her father thought it was a guy from back at the house where they had dinner. She tried to explain to him that it was something else, something larger and more terrifying than that guy. Her father called to the woods angrily, demanding that whoever was there show himself. This was the last thing my grandmother wanted to happen. She pulled her father and mother's clothes, trying to get them to leave that area. Grandma said that they could see a shadow in the trees, and she thought it was going to come out and show itself, as her father had commanded. Instead, it howled. Grandma says her father and mother both went pale when they realized that she was right, and it was not a man at all pursuing them, but a giant carnivorous beast. They tried to move away toward the station as quickly as they could, but they were all carrying luggage, and women wore a lot more clothes back in those days. It was this whole thing. So the going was not very fast. Grandma told us she knew what it wanted was her. She also realized that if a beast that large and savage wanted her, it could have her, and there was nothing her parents could do about it. She was going to have to depend on luck, or the Dogman deciding not to take her for whatever reason. They still had over an hour of walking to get to the train station or any kind of civilization at all. Just then, a voice called out to them from their right. Squinting in that direction, she could make out light from lamps. They quickly headed in that direction and realized the calls were coming from an old man who was driving a wooden cart with his horse. He said he saw they had wandered off the road and wanted to warn them to steer clear of those woods at night. He told them that lots of folks wander off the road at night and are never heard from again. Grandma says she begged the man to give them a lift to the train station, but he had just come from that direction and had no need to go back till the next day. Finally, they offered him the amount they would have paid to stay at the hotel to carry them to safety, and he agreed. The three of them rode in the wooden cart in the back, watching the road behind them. Grandma said the moon was setting behind the trees and it was getting darker and harder to see. After a while, though, she started to hear sounds which seemed to indicate that they were perhaps being followed. It was all on one side, to her right, the side she'd seen the Dogman on. Grandma called to the driver to please drive faster. He argued that he was going as fast as he was getting paid to go, but he was interrupted by a loud growl coming from the darkness. "Yes, ma'am, I'll drive her faster." They held on tight as the speeding cart bumped up and down and side to side all over the dirt and stone road. Grandma says that as loud as the horse and cart got, she could still hear the thing following them in the woods. And then she saw it. They all saw it. Brazenly running right down the center of the road behind them was the hairy, dog-headed man she had seen earlier. You could see him for a second in the dim light provided by the lamps. Then he'd disappear back into the darkness, only to emerge again as he gained on them. He was even taller than Grandma had realized earlier. She said he was an insane feral caveman with a dog head. I remember asking her why she called it a caveman. Did it wear clothes? She said no. Did it have long hair like a caveman? She said no. It had dog-length hair, whatever she meant by that. Grandma seemed to feel that this was something prehistoric, and it had the basic body shape of a man. So I guess to her, that meant it was a caveman or proto-human. So where was I? Oh, right. The Dogman was now openly running after their cart. She could see it had dark gray fur, darker and lighter in various areas, and that its eyes glowed like they were lit by candles. Even when it would fall back into darkness, you could still see the eye shine for a while after the body was completely in darkness. The monster snarled and snapped at them, making it very clear its intentions toward them were of the worst kind. Grandma said it had claws on its fingers and toes, but seemed like a furry man other than that, and the head. It ran like a man, on 2 legs. She said it never dropped to 4 legs. It was walking or running bipedally throughout the entire incident. One time she told us it had no tail. The next time she said she thought it might have had one. I think I forgot to ask about the tail the last time she told the story. It seems she mainly saw it from the front, and for that reason, I'm not sure she would have seen the tail much, whether it was there or not. So there it is. A werewolf or Dogman. It's gaining on them, getting closer and closer to their cart, and it has such a look of hatred on its face that Grandma said it was all she could do to keep from fainting. She's screaming at the guy to drive the horse faster. All of Grandma's family is screaming at the guy to go faster. Her mom and dad and probably all her dead ancestors too. The theoretical idea of me was probably screaming at this guy too. After all, if Grandma got taken by a Dogman, I wouldn't ever get to be born. So, in the cart, Grandma now saw the lights of the train station. The Dogman did as well, and it ceased its chase, allowing them to rejoin their own kind. Grandma said it just melted back into the darkness as they approached civilization, and that was the last she ever saw it, or heard of it, or anything like it. I asked Grandma if this turned her off to show business or to accepting invitations from the audience. She said back in her day you didn't have the option of being turned off to something. Life was hard. If you had a traumatic experience in the woods, you went back out there the next day as though nothing had happened. If a member of the audience turned out to be a psycho, you were just as friendly to the next audience the next night. There was no other option. It was about survival. "Didn't you know," she asked me, "I met your grandfather when he was an audience member after one of my last shows. Now that is the real story of why I quit show business, not the werewolf story. The werewolf encounter was just another night in vaudeville. Trust me." Grandma might have preferred to put on a brave face about it, but she wouldn't have retold the story so many times if it hadn't been a shocking and memorable occurrence, as opposed to just another night in vaudeville. She was a tough old lady, but even my grandma would have been no match against the savagery of a feral Dogman. An entire pack of Dogman, as told to Peter Bernard, read by P.Q. Ribber. I'm fascinated by stories of Dogman because of this thing that happened to me when I was young that I'm about to tell you. But in almost all the stories, the Dogman acts alone. The one and only time I saw a Dogman, I think I saw 11 of them all at once. This is the story of that night. Okay, I was around 11, I guess. It was summer, New Jersey, 1970s. Hot, sweaty, boring. The internet hadn't been invented yet, etc. I was hanging with a buddy of mine, getting in trouble out at the edge of Chatham, and we ended up wandering, possibly illegally, into the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. We loved it in there. It was like going back to the age of the dinosaurs. We saw weird birds and insects in there and joked around that Tyrannosaurus Rex and cavemen lived further into the park. Anyway, this one time we were in there, we stayed after it had started to get dark. We hadn't ever done that before, but we really had no sense of the possible dangers that exist after dark for two completely unprepared teenagers in a wildlife refuge. As it turns out, they call it wildlife for a reason. So anyway, my buddy and I are hanging out at a rock behind some trees on the edge of this grassy area that has a wall at one end, just a plain, nondescript wall. I can't tell what's on the other side. I'm not sure if it's a wall of a building or just a wall in the woods. I didn't think twice about it, but then I thought I saw some guy go over, lean on the wall, and light up a cigarette. I say I thought I saw this because I just noticed it peripherally. I was mainly talking to my friend and not paying attention to the wall beyond it. But I remember seeing the smoking guy because it made me think. The wall must be part of a business, and there's an employee taking a smoking break. It helped me define the odd wall and That's why I remembered it. So then, after a while, out of the corner of my eye, I think I see a bear or a Bigfoot walk over to the cigarette-smoking guy. That immediately draws my attention, and I look directly at the scene. I motion for my buddy to be quiet and look as well. When I squint, I can see that it's not a bear, and it's not a Bigfoot. It's not a man either. It's a dog walking on its hind legs. At first I thought this meant it was a dog doing a trick, and I relaxed, thinking the mystery had been explained. But then my gaze drifted over to the cigarette-smoking fellow, and I saw that he was wearing a dog head mask. That really freaked me out, and I gasped loudly. I was afraid they heard me, so I ducked down behind the rock. We both did. Now we were facing away from the scene, and we were both thoroughly freaked out. I asked my buddy what kind of a nut job wears a dog mask in the woods. My buddy didn't think it was a mask. I started looking at him like he was on drugs or something, but he was shaking all over, and he was convinced we were looking at either werewolves or maybe native shamans or shapeshifters. We sat there silently, and I considered what he had said. Then, slowly, quietly, stealthily, I turned around to face the scene across the meadow again, and I took a peek. The smoking man was now joined by a few more standing dogs. I realize now that the man was not wearing clothes, and that he was, in fact, one of the standing dogs himself. I had thought he was wearing dark clothes, but that was his fur. This was a scene of madness and horror. I whispered to my friend, "What do we do?" He whispered back, "Let's watch them." And so, that's what we did. I'm not sure how long we were there, but it must have been something like 60 or 90 minutes. One by one, more dogmen arrived. They seemed to be separating into groups and having quiet conversations among themselves, although there were also one or two who I remember standing alone by themselves. This just continued and continued as the night came on, and the sky grew darker and darker and darker. There must have been 10 or 12 of them there by that point. And then, all at once, without any warning whatsoever, every one of those dogmen or werewolves or brujos or whatever they were ran off in a different direction. At lightning speed they erupted in all directions. Several of them were heading in our direction. I only remember running after that. I remember running like nothing else existed, like the only reason I was born was to run. I did not see my life flashing in front of my eyes. I was not going to die that day. I ran over, under, around, and through every part of that forest until we reached the edge of the wild area and escaped back to the land of the humans. I never looked back, and we were both lucky enough to have never seen those dogmen ever again. A couple or 3 days later, I was in a newsstand store in town, and there was a new comic book on the stands with a werewolf on the cover. We were both talking about where the artist got it right and where he got it wrong. One of the old guys in the store was laughing at us, this Native American guy. He asked why we thought we knew what real werewolves looked like. Being kids, we just told him. We saw them lining up by the wall in the woods before they went off to hunt. The old Native American guy stopped laughing at us, and he got this weird expression on his face. Finally, he told us that his father always said that the wall in the woods was a gathering place for bad spirits. He just assumed his father was going mental when he said stuff like that, but our story was sort of freaking him out. So Anyway, fast forward to the summer of 2014. My buddy and I decided on Facebook we would meet and try to relocate that old wall in the woods and take pictures of it. During the day this time. We're not as brave as we once were. Okay, so we met and we entered the forest, this time with GPS to help guide our way to where we thought the wall was. Short version of the story is that we never found that wall or even that meadow or pasture in our entire day of searching. Either we were looking in the wrong place or the wall's been taken down. It's possible we walked past the site several times without recognizing it, and it's also possible that we never got close to it. So really, all that I've got in the end is a story. I saw a gathering of dog-headed men at dusk. I saw them disperse. I don't know why either of these things happened or what any of it means. The only thing I know is that dogmen do have a social structure and they do communicate with each other. And that's the true story of the only time I ever saw Dogman.
If you want to meet a person who's really caring, why not try Sharon? Well, it rhymed. Please join me in thanking Sharon Smirnoff for helping me make this episode possible. Sharon is a member of our PayPal subscribers club, which you can too join at peterbernard.com to join. We also have channel memberships here on YouTube which have the same perks, including our secret uncensored Dogman episodes. Here to explain it in more detail is our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank? Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.